Hi, I wanted to begin by thanking the organizers for all of their work in putting this conference together and coming up with such a great format for us to be able to share ideas with one another despite the conditions of the pandemic. I also wanted to just briefly mention how immensely humbled and inspired I am by the popular initiative and intelligence that's been demonstrated by all those participating in the growing popular uprising against racial capitalism over the past several weeks. The questions that I'm trying to address here are questions that I think really owe their significance to the long history of popular uprising, the long history of resistance that's challenged the exploitative, racist, heterosexist capitalist order from its origins in the colonial encounter of 1492, all the way through until just the past few weeks. So shout out to everyone who's been on the streets. So I want to use this time to make a broad case for the advantages to building a bridge between the concerns of contemporary analytic social ontology and Marx's feminist unitary theory. I take these research areas to have much to offer one another. Social ontology, particularly the realist, externalist, constructivist social ontology of Sally Haslanger, that I'll be addressing here, has developed a fine-grained conceptual toolkit for understanding the mode of existence of social kinds and the types of dependency relations that these kinds have on social practices. From the Marxian side, unitary theory has inherited a focus on the historical specificity of social form and the historically variable mechanisms of what I call social synthesis that link social practices into unified systems from Marx's late work on the capitalist mode of production. And I've recorded another brief video on unitary theory that viewers might be interested in having a look at if they're unfamiliar with that term. So at stake in this confluence are questions like, are race and gender as we know them constituted by capitalism, or do they have meaningful existence outside of it? Are patriarchy and white supremacy separate systems that interact with capitalism, or is capitalism a system that necessarily produces relations of racial and gender domination? Importantly, these and other questions at the intersection of these two discourses are closely tied to social theoretical positions that are in turn influenced by historical, sociological, economic, anthropological, and other forms of inquiry into the world. Answers to these key questions require work in all of these domains. That said, I'm proceeding here at a sort of degree of abstraction from my own view of how these questions are best addressed in order to highlight only their social ontological dimensions, which I do think are interesting and consequential, even if the corresponding social theoretical accounts remain to be completed. I think there's a lot of work, and there's, I think, really good partial answers to a lot of these questions from the perspective of social theory. But I'm sort of assuming or taking it as if a demonstration for the necessarily racialized and gendered character of capitalism has been made, and then looking at the social ontological questions that surround such a demonstration, rather than trying to make a case for that directly here. Okay, so I came to social ontology looking for a way to proceed from what I took to be an impasse in recent debates within unitary theory. So unitary theory argues that rather than there being multiple external systems of oppression, say capitalism, patriarchy, and white supremacy, that interact to produce complex phenomena of intersectional oppression, there is instead one unified social system that we can call capitalism, but that's not merely an economic system, but rather a complex and contradictorily articulated social order that reproduces itself through relations of exploitation, but also expropriation and alienation. However, this account typically remains ambiguous as to the relationship between differential, racialized, and gendered social categories and differentiated relational positions within the overall process of the reproduction of capitalism. So one proposal that I've been sympathetic to has suggested that we might elaborate a logic of gender that would delineate categories of gender, and I think here we can take the point more generally and extend it to thinking about categories of race as well, that are as specific to capitalism as capital itself. So I think to realize this kind of a proposal, we have to reread Marx's philosophical method in the Critique of Political Economy in the late work in light of contemporary social ontology. So we need to understand the logic of capital as is presented in the 3 volumes of Das Kapital, not as an abstract model built out of empirical generalizations about capitalism, but rather as an elaboration of a set of interlocking constrained schemas of practice that are in turn the grounding practices that set parameters for real distinctions between constructed social kinds. We're reading Marx as philosophically already doing a kind of social ontology, and then making sense of that through a dialogue between Marxian thought and contemporary analytic social ontology. So I want to introduce 3 ideas from Marx that I take to be central to his late philosophical project and relevant to addressing our questions. So the first, and here I've included a quite long quote from Marx's 1857 introduction. I'm not going to read it, but you might be interested to pause and give it a read. So here, Marx calls the efficacy of transhistorical categories of social analysis into question. A seemingly simple concept like economic production takes on vastly different meanings within the context of differently ordered societies. It requires historical research to untangle which aspects of this abstraction are general and apply to all societies, and which aspects are particular to a given society. Further, Marx suggests that this is a general problem for social theory. Our categories are necessarily abstract when we begin research, but it is the task of researchers to develop categories by discovering their historical, context-specific determinations and their interrelations with other social categories within organic wholes. So the content of the concept production, insofar as it grasps something real about how a given society functions, is going to change in accordance with the overall organization of the society analyzed. Marx scholar Patrick Murray has argued that within Marx's late work, 2 different kinds of abstract concepts operate. There are concepts like labor in general, which are transhistorical abstractions that grasp only what is common to labor across social forms, for example, that it involves the expenditure of energy. But these concepts are not particularly useful in analyzing any given society, or what is needed instead are another type of abstraction, which would be historically specific abstractions, concepts that grasp the complex of determinations that concretely inform social practices within a given historical context. So in the context of production, here, an historically specific abstraction would be practically abstracted surplus value producing production, for example. Because this perspective requires us to make reference to the historically specific social context that categories operate within, we're faced with the question of what individuates an historical context or society. So I take Marx to hold that's an individuated mode of socio-natural reproduction that individuates a given social form. So what is a mode of socio-natural reproduction is a particular form under which social relations are organized in order to meet the requirements of the reproduction of human life. A social system, if it's to be autonomous, genuinely individuated, must be able to motivate the reproduction of its own conditions of existence by organizing social practice in characteristic ways. The characteristic way in which social practice is organized under capitalism is the value dynamic, or what I'll term value-mediated sociality. So value refers to the emergent dynamic of social constraint on production in temporal terms that takes off once the production of commodities for the sake of exchange on markets is socially generalized. It includes what's typically referred to as competition under capitalism. Value is characteristically abstract mode of socio-natural reproduction that is indifferent to all concrete content and respects only particular formal distinctions between social relations. For example, whether production is carried out under the wage form or under a different form of labor constraint. So typically when Marxists refer to the logic of capital, what they mean by this is the value dynamic in all of its many determinations as presented by Marx in the 3 volumes of Capital. I follow Marxian scholars like Nancy Fraser, Bolivar Echeverria, and Chris Arthur in holding that the value dynamic dominates capitalist societies, but not exhaustively. There are a number of additional social relations not mediated in value terms that are necessary to the functioning of the value dynamic and the accumulation of capital. These are what Nancy Fraser has called capitalism's background conditions. And here I want to suggest that the distinction between formally capitalist, informally capitalist, and entirely non-capitalist social practices and categories is a crucial distinction for an historically specific social ontology of capitalist societies. So from the perspective of value, only world-transforming activity that leads to the production of successfully exchanged commodities contributes to social reproduction. Importantly, the very same concrete activities under capitalism, so cooking a meal, for example, can be formally capitalist, say if you're cooking as a chef and employed in a restaurant seeking a profit. Cooking could be informally capitalist if it's carried out in the home, but for the purpose of feeding a worker or potential worker. It could also be non-capitalist if it's carried out in the home for the purpose of, say, feeding a retired person or for a celebration. It's kind of a thing. Only activities that are formally capitalist are registered in value terms and fully mediated and reshaped according to the constraints of the value dynamic. But I take it to be nevertheless a legitimate extension of the notion of a logic of capital to include informally capitalist practices under this heading as well, to the extent that they are practically constrained by the reproduction of capitalism. To the extent that they're necessary conditions for the reproduction of capitalism, and that sets into motion a whole institutional apparatus of constraint on these practices in order to ensure that they continue to play the role that they need to play in order for capital accumulation to occur. So now I'm going to turn to some ideas from Sally Haslanger's work in order to suggest the unitary theory concerned with specifying the parameters for the social construction of historically specific race and gender kinds need not refer to vaguely specified patriarchal and white supremacist systems, but can instead analyze the reproduction of modern forms of racial and gender oppression as processes of constitutively constructive, informally capitalist social practice. So the first thing I want to pick up from Haslanger is her realism about social kinds. So as I figure is probably familiar to most viewers, Haslanger has argued that some social kinds, like race and gender, are both metaphysically objective, meaning that there's something about how the world is that delineates the boundaries of these kinds, and socially constituted, meaning these delineating features are social features. These are the features that are relevant for determining kind membership. Importantly, Haslanger's conception of a type or kind is comparatively minimal. So she endorses a Kripke and Putnam-inspired realist semantic type externalism about social kinds for which objective types need only have a degree of unity among their members beyond a random or gerrymandered set. In the case of social kinds, a kind can have unity on the basis of relational properties, such as the role that it plays in a social practice. In the cases that we're interested in, the kinds race and gender, the relevant features to determine are the social practices by virtue of which individuals are constitutively constructed as differentially gendered and racialized. And I take this position to be a really helpful way of thinking through Marx's idea of real abstractions that you find also in the 1857 introduction and then at work in the Critique of Political Economy. So what Marx is referring to here are real social practices that involve treating other practices indifferently in some respect or another. So this introduces a kind of effective generality into the social world. There's a certain abstraction away from concrete differences among practices that is systematically reproduced in social practice. The next idea from Haslanger that I want to pick up is that in this context, I think it's very significant that for Haslanger, there can be social kinds that are dependent on the pattern behavior of people without accompanying attitudes or beliefs. So really existing social distinctions don't need to be indexed to representational or attitudinal distinctions in either individual or collective intentionality. Instead, the basic units of the social, on Haslanger's recent view, are practices. So I've included a recent full definition of practices from Haslanger on the slide. Practices are bipolar on this account, so they have a source pole and a schema pole. And sources are anything that is assigned a negative or positive value by a schema within the context of a practice. And a schema is an objective complex of public social meanings that can be linguistic or paralinguistic that orients how a source is interacted with. So practices then are individuated, they're constitutively constrained on the one hand by the properties of their sources, including mind-independent material features of their sources that play a role in shaping the way that schemas orient our ways of interacting with them. But practices are also constrained by their embeddedness within milieux or networks of other practices. So practices come to limit, interact with, facilitate, and constrain other practices. The final idea that I want to pick up from Haslanger is the critique of ontological individualism that she inherits from Brian Epstein's recent work and plugs into her broader picture of the social. So Haslanger picks up Epstein's critique of ontological individualism, which is a critique on the grounds that social facts are not exhaustively determined by individualistic facts, in order to deepen her materialist account of social practice. Social practices and the distinctions that they produce in the world are not exhaustively constituted by individuals in their relations, but are, in many cases, co-constituted by mind-independent properties of their sources. This crucial point opens a path, I think, towards a reconstruction of the micro-foundations of the Marxian account of social structure that can avoid the cul-de-sac of methodological individualism that derailed the project of analytic Marxism. So I think we can sort of still ask after really robust explanatory social theoretical accounts to make our case for larger scale Marxian points, but doing so doesn't require taking on methodological individualism. I think we can adopt Haslanger's approach to the systematicity of the social and an account of the social which includes non-individualistic contributors. So I think these three ideas from Haslanger taken together make up the outline for a social constructivism that's broadly compatible with the framework of Marx's late work, and that offers us a means to understand the mode of objective existence of social kinds, the mode of dependence of social kinds on social practices, and the excess of social practice over individual or collective intentionality. In relationship to our problematic unitary theory, I think they suggest the possibility of producing an analysis of the network of concrete practices that are involved in the reproduction of the social actuality of oppressive, racialized, and gendered social relations, and indeed of race and gender as we know them as such. To try to tie all this together, so as I tried to mention at the beginning, I can't offer here an explanatory account of how I think the reproduction of capital necessitates the reproduction of hierarchical race and gender kinds. This is a case that requires a great deal of empirical research, but I will argue that in treating the social ontology of capitalist society, we need to account for the centrality of the formally indifferent value dynamic to the background conditions under which race and gender are socially constructed under global capitalism. So this is not to argue that there's a kind of gender and race blind capitalism that's somehow more fundamental than social relations of oppression, nor is it to make the unfortunately familiar argument that something called class is universal while racial and gender oppressions are particular. On the contrary, my argument is that we are better positioned to understand both the logic of capital as it concretely operates and the social actuality of racialized and gendered oppression by focusing on the ways in which the value dynamic, as a mode of socio-natural metabolism, constrains but does not fully determine kind constitutive social practice. The indifference of capitalism qua mediating structure markedly distinguishes it from such social system concepts as patriarchy that make reference to exogenous ends, such as the production and maintenance of men's domination. That capitalism is essentially a mediating structure is crucial to why unitary theorists take it to be the correct name for the social order as a whole. So as capital cyclically reproduces the constraints necessary for its reproduction, it simultaneously reinforces the social necessity of gender distinction and race. In this way, the construction of particular race and gender categories within given societies is constrained by the implication of these societies in the global dynamic of capital accumulation. There's a great deal of variation that's nevertheless possible due to the contribution of differing local, historical, cultural, natural, linguistic, and other factors to local practices of racialization and gender distinction. But I do want to argue that variation among local practices is nevertheless limited by the pressures of the value dynamic. So I think then that a defensible unitary theory can make the claim that capitalism, qua mode of socio-natural metabolism, socio-natural reproduction, sets the global parameters of race and gender constitution, that local concrete contexts of racialization and gender distinction will also be informed by non-capitalist social practices that might have varying degrees of systematicity, that might have varying mechanisms for their reproduction, but that aren't as robust and globally expanded as the value dynamic. So I think in this way we can say race and gender as we know them are indeed partially but crucially constituted by capitalism. If, as I believe it can be demonstrated, capitalism depends upon relations of racial and gender domination, then we can account for the continued reproduction of oppressive race and gender kinds with reference to constraints on concrete practice that capital accumulation produces in societies where commodity production is generalized and access to the means of subsistence is market mediated. Finally, it's the systematic reproduction of capitalist social relations, including the background conditions, background relations, that secures beyond individual or group intention the continued existence of exploitation and various forms of expropriation, dispossession, moral degradation. Then social struggles against all of these wrongs have a shared target, the value dynamic that acts as the carrier wave through which the reproduction of all of these practices is mediated. Nothing guarantees that they will not return in other forms, but the abolition of value, I claim, is necessary to the abolition of racial and gender oppression as we know them. Thank you for your attention. I look forward to continuing this discussion.